pleased to welcome along Dr. Vicky West of Scottish Forestry, who was heavily involved in the development of and manages the Woodland Carbon Code, and George Hepburn-Scott, Business Development Director at Forest Carbon, one of the first carbon trading companies on the scene. Carbon trading's been in place for a good many years now, but it's only really now that it's gathering momentum, with various pressures causing businesses and individuals to recognise the need to reduce and offset their carbon emissions and turn words into actions. Key to the success and regulation of woodland carbon trading is the Woodland Carbon Code. It's important that both sellers and buyers understand what the implications are of getting involved so they can make the correct choices. Woodland carbon sales may not suit or work for everybody. So I hope that the presentations by Vicky and George will assist you in that. Anyway, that's enough of me now. Vicky, can I ask you to start your presentation, please?
Thank you, Malcolm. I'll just get my presentation up on the screen. Okay, so hopefully you can all see my presentation just now. I'm Vicky West. I work for Scottish Forestry, but I manage the Woodland Carbon Code on behalf of the whole of the UK government. I'd like to give you a little bit of information about the carbon market and how it's growing, who's involved, and then a bit of an overview on how to apply, and then there'll be a chance for questions. After I've spoken, George Hepburn-Scott from Forest Carbon is going to give a bit more information in terms of how Forest Carbon work with the Carbon Code and the kind of projects that they've been involved in. So the Carbon Code was launched in 2011, and it's a standard approved by government across the UK for woodland creation projects, and it's a way of connecting landowners who want to plant trees with corporates who are looking to offset their emissions, and a way of moving private sector money into to landowners for woodland creation. So the standard is based on the same principles as other global carbon standards. So there needs to be a high standard, and it needs to be supported by three things, which is robust science or carbon measurement, transparent registry, so it's clear who owns what carbon at the end of the day, and independent validation and verification, so a third-party check of projects. I just wanted to mention at this point as well that there's also a peatland code, which is developed by IUCN, and that's developed along the same lines as the Woodland Carbon Code, but it deals with peatland restoration. So if any landowners have peatlands they're looking to restore, as well as areas that they might be looking to create woodlands, then there's like a parallel process where you could do that, and it follows these same principles. So where's this demand for carbon coming from? Well, there's lots of policies from the UK government and from the Scottish government and globally. You'll have heard lots of talk about the climate emergency, the UK government's commitment to reach net zero by 2050, and Scotland's commitment to get there 5 years earlier. The Climate Change Committee recommended to government, and government have approved that we need to be planting 30,000 hectares a year of new woodland to help us meet that net zero target. That's one of the many measures that needs to happen. And both governments, Scotland and UK, have committed to develop this stronger domestic carbon offset market, which at the moment is mostly woodlands and peatland. So if we think about the buyer end of this, who is buying this carbon? So it's mainly UK-based companies that are doing this for corporate and social responsibility, or if they're formally accounting for their emissions to help them compensate for their UK-based emissions. So of the carbon that's been validated through the scheme so far, around 70% of it has been sold up front at prices between £5 and £20 per tonne of CO2. So that's around 1.5 million credits that have been sold already. Now, we all know woodlands take a while to grow. We check on woodlands after 5 years and every 10 years. So there's a small amount of carbon, this 5,000 tonnes, that's been checked at year 5, and over 90% of that carbon that's been checked at year 5 has been sold. So that's just an idea of the kind of sales so far. On this page also is a list of companies that have bought carbon from the Woodland Carbon Code projects, to give you an idea of the range of companies and sectors that are looking to buy carbon. There's another scheme in England where the government is offering to buy carbon credits from landowners. And this is called the Woodland Carbon Guarantee. As I say, this is England only at the moment, but this is sort of government intervening to help encourage the development of the market and encourage landowners to take part and create more woodland. Within the market, there's also more intermediaries coming into the market. So these are companies that have corporate clients who are looking to reduce their net emissions or improve their environmental credentials. And these companies would help a corporate to manage their greenhouse gas emissions, help them work out how to reduce that and to offset any residual emissions. So Forest Carbon are one of the main companies that have been working with the Carbon Code the longest, but these other companies are also providing this service and have provided access to market. Forest Carbon also have a carbon club. They've set up this way for smaller companies to have a sort of annual direct debit payment to pay for carbon credits. And there is quite a lot of people that are interested in developing apps to allow individuals to contribute to woodland carbon projects. So that's a bit about the market and how the interest. So just a bit now about the standard and the requirements of the standard. So the Woodland Carbon Code is a carbon standard that sets the baseline at the UK Forestry Standard. So all projects need to meet the UK Forestry Standard, but they also have to meet these other criteria, which are important in all carbon standards globally. And these things are represented in all carbon standards. So one is additionality. I'll say a bit more about that at the minute, but it's the concept from the buyer's perspective that they want to buy something extra to business as usual, to what's normally happening. So they want to know that their money is really making a difference. And the next thing is permanence. So while we know that individual trees might live and die, the ton of carbon that you sell to somebody, we need to know that it's a permanent ton of carbon. And we rely partly on the UK legislation, but also we don't allow anybody to sell all the carbon from their project. They need to put 20% of the potential carbon units into a buffer, which is like a shared pool and an insurance policy in case any carbon's lost in future. Projects also need to restock if they have any losses for wind, fire, pest or disease. So that's permanence. Another important aspect is being able to have robust science and look at your carbon sequestration in your project. We need to think about what would have happened if your project hadn't gone ahead, how much would have been sequestered, whether your project is causing any emissions anywhere else, and obviously the sequestration of your actual project. We also need to be really clear with the companies that are buying carbon, the kind of things they're allowed to say about the credits that they're buying from these projects. And we've set out these statements clearly on the website. We also have a brief look at the wider social environmental benefits of the project. So when people are buying from a carbon code project, they might be buying a ton of CO2, but knowing that it also delivers a whole host of other benefits, such as flood prevention or community benefits or recreation benefits or things like that, then that makes that unit more attractive. So there's the opportunity to kind of promote those wider benefits. So coming back to the additionality, because it's often asked about, there's two tests for the financial additionality. And like I said, this is a way of trying to show to the buyer that the project wouldn't have happened without their income, without the income from them, without this carbon income. So the first test is about saying that carbon income is a significant part of the project. So we test that by saying the carbon income needs to equate to at least 15% of the planting and establishment cost to year 10. Now this test at the moment is normally okay to pass if you're doing a broadleaf project and you generate at least £5 per tonne of CO2. It can be more difficult for productive conifer projects, and George is going to explain a bit more later about the amount of carbon that could be claimed from different project types. The other part of the financial additionality test is just really kind of, is your project viable? So you can say your project's additional if either it's not financially viable to create woodland without having the carbon money, or the woodland creation project could be financially viable in that you have a positive net present value, but you're making less money from woodland than you would do from farming, and that the carbon money makes that project more attractive or makes the woodland kind of equitable with farming. So these are the two tests that we need to think about with additionality. One of the things that underpins the standard we talked about was having robust science. So we've got forest research to generate two tools for us. One helps us predict carbon over the lifetime of the project. So we can say at the outset how much carbon you're likely to generate and how much income you're likely to generate. And the other tool is an assessment protocol to help us monitor trees and work out how much carbon they've actually stored as they grow. The second thing that needs to underpin the standard is the registry. So we have this Woodland Carbon Registry, and it's a register of all the projects and every carbon unit or tonne of CO2 from that project. And it allows us to track the issuance of carbon units, who owns each carbon unit, when carbon units are transferred between people, if you sell a carbon unit, and the use of carbon units. So when a company uses the carbon unit, that's tracked as well. And there's two types of unit in the system to take account of the fact that woodlands take ages to grow. So up front, we have these promise to deliver units called pending issuance units. And when we know how much your woodland has grown, we can convert them to woodland carbon units, which is actual sequestration in the tree. So that's two things that underpin the standard. This is just a page from the registry that shows, it gives an example of what you can see about the carbon units. So this page shows a number of carbon units. You can see the time they're going to be delivered in the vintage. You can see the project name. You can see the account. So most of these units are sold, and you can see the buyers in the account column. You can see the project type. You can see who's verified it, and you can see the number of units. So that's just an example from the public registry. You'd be able to look at this yourselves. Then just quickly to say how we're progressing. So I guess as a summary at the moment, I'd say that the carbon market is increasing massively. In the last 12 months, the number of projects has doubled. We've gone from just over 250 to over 500 across the whole of the UK. So the numbers in brackets of Scotland, the other numbers are UK numbers. So half of the projects are validated, so they've been checked at the outset, and there's another over 250, so 268 are just going through the process to be checked at the outset. So that number of projects is on the increase very rapidly at the moment, and there's a lot more participants in the market, from landowners, forest agents who are helping landowners, and from the buyer end as well. I thought I'd just give you a little bit of information about the costs involved in the project, and then the likely income, and then talk through the application process. So there are some costs involved in being part of the scheme. So registering your project is free. You have to do that within 2 years of planting. Then you need to get validated, which is this third-party check. And there is a cost to that per project, but there are savings if your projects are grouped. So a project developer could put several projects through validation in one go, and then it's much cheaper. There is also a cost to list carbon units on the registry, which is 6p per unit. Again, at verification, there's a cost for this third-party check, and a cost of 3p per unit within the registry to convert your units. And again, it's cheaper if projects are part of a group. Then if we look at the potential income, so if you were to generate, say you were to get between £5 and £15 per tonne of CO2, a native woodland might sequester around 400 tonnes of CO2 over 100 years. Now this means that per hectare you would generate between £2,000 and £6,000 per hectare in income from the carbon. For that carbon that's going to be sequestered over 100 years. So that's, you need to kind of balance that cost and income. I'll just say, I've got a slide that does that, but I'll just say as a quick reminder that there's no VAT on voluntary carbon credits. They're not a VATable amount. And also that carbon income is tax-free. It's treated like forestry and timber income. So there's no tax to pay on the income you make from carbon. So this is a slide just to try and put together those costs and income. So the top example is for a conifer woodland of 100 hectares over 45 years. The middle and the bottom examples are native woodlands of 125 hectares over 95 years. And the two columns on the right show how much income you might generate if the carbon price was £5 or £10 per tonne of CO2. So you can see for each project the potential gross income from the carbon, then the estimated cost of being involved in the carbon code, so validating, verifying, and having your units in the registry, and then a net carbon income for that kind of project. So one thing to bear in mind here, that this is the direct cash cost. There will also be some documentation to complete and survey work at the site to carry out. But depending on your experience, landowners could potentially do those things themselves, but they might end up paying a forest agent to do those things for them. And Forest Carbon will explain how their model works later on. So in terms of applying for the code, there's a few steps that we've kind of talked about as we've gone through this. So the first thing to think about is whether you want to try and do the application yourself or whether you want to ask an agent to help you. And there's a growing list of agents who would offer to help you with your carbon project, and these are displayed here. Now there's a range, agents provide a different skill set or different options. So some of these would actually help you with the woodland creation and your grant application, as well as the carbon code application. Some of them would help with surveying and verification ongoing, and some of them also provide a route to market and have a route to help find you buyers. So some just do one end, they help with the woodland creation and get you validated. Some also provide the route to buyers. And again, Forest Carbon will explain how their role in that in a moment. So within the application process, the first thing you need to do is register your project. And what's really important is that you need to register ideally at the planning stage. So these are new woodlands. There is a technical limit at the moment that you have to register within 2 years of the start of planting, but we're going to change that deadline to 6 months. Probably by the end of the year. So just bear that in mind. Ideally, you're registering at the planning stage and it's free. So you can do that on your own, or you can work with a project developer or agent, and they can create groups of projects, which is cheaper for the validation verification. And to register, you need a map and you need a carbon calculation. And there's a template spreadsheet to do that on the Carbon Code website. The next stage of the process is to have a third-party check of your project. So all the trees need to be in the ground for this to be signed off, but you can progress this whilst you're in the planting phase. So again, there's a bit of a cost. You have to do it within 3 years of registering, and it has to be carried out by one of these bodies who are accredited to do the validation, so Soil Association or Organic Farmers and Growers. And in order to get validated, you need the 2 documents we mentioned before, and you also need to complete this project design document, which explains how you meet the carbon standard. And you also have to do this assessment of additionality to show that your project is financially additional, so it wouldn't have happened without carbon finance. So that's what you need to do to get verified, and once you're verified, we issue these pending issuance units or promise to deliver units on the registry, and at that point you'd be able to sell the carbon units. The next stage is that we need to know how the project is progressing. So after year 5 and every 10 years, you need to do some monitoring to look at how the woodland is growing and assess the sequestration, and again get that third party checked by Soil Association or Organic Farmers and Growers. In order to do this, you need your monitoring report, which is your survey results, and you need to do a project progress report, which just says that yes, you're still meeting the standard, and you have to tell us if anything's changed about your project. So in summary, for the app, how you apply, think about whether you want to use an agent or whether you want to do it yourself. Then you need to register, ideally while you're at the planning stage of your woodland creation project. And then as you're planting the trees, you need to do your project design document, get it third-party checked, validated, and then we issue these pending issuance units, and you have carbon units that you could sell up front. Then at year 5, you need to monitor your trees, work out how much carbon's been sequestered so far, complete the progress report, get that third-party checked, verified, and then we convert your units into actual woodland carbon units for what's actually been delivered. And then you need to repeat that process every 10 years. So the project could be up to 100 years long, but it's up to you, and it depends on the type of woodland as to the best project length. That's probably all I'm going to say for now. So if there's any questions immediately for me, please ask away, and then we'll hand over to George.
Thanks very much, Vicky. That was really interesting. A good summary of something that is, I think, condensing a very what could potentially be a complex subject down into 20 minutes. We've got a question here. The buffer element of 20% only during the verification period, or is this unable to be traded at any point? E.g., after the 40-year cycle applied for, can the 20% be traded should there be verification of the PIUs into WCUs, or is it an insurance policy that helps cover the shortfalls of other schemes?
So, so everybody puts 20% into the buffer, and the idea of the buffer is to for the buyer, that they know that the ton of CO2 they purchased is permanent. So that means that each project, if they suffer a loss, they can claim for the buffer. They could claim more than the 20% they've put in, because it's a bit like an insurance policy. But there are rules about what you might have to pay back. But the 20% would never be able to be traded. So at the end of the project duration, we stop monitoring the project, but we also don't allow you to have the buffer units back. So it's, in some sense, then there's some kind of buffer for the future once we stop monitoring what's happening with each project.
Okay, thank you. I wonder if I can ask a couple of questions as well. There might be a few other people out there wondering it as well. With it being potentially 100-year-long involvement, what sort of legal implications might there be if the property is sold at, say, 10, 15 years from now, or at some point during the carbon contract?
So at the moment, we don't require any covenant on the land or anything, but we do require that there's like a set of landowner commitments, and one of the things in those commitments is that you will at least inform the future landowner of your commitments under the Woodland Carbon Code. In terms of sales of land that have gone on recently, a few of the Carbon Code projects have been sold, and mostly the new landowners have been willing to take on that commitment. So it is something to think about, because you need to think, if you've sold the carbon units up front, you are potentially passing on a liability, and it might be reflected in the sale price. If you haven't sold the units, you're potentially passing on an asset that the future landowner would be able to sell the units. So again, it would be reflected in the sales price the other way around, and that you might generate more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so something that needs a bit of careful thought there, right?
Yeah.
And another question for you, if you don't mind. Can you say something about registering for carbon after planting, and is that something that's possible? And if it is possible, then is there any sort of evidence needed to back up the whole carbon requirement, the additionality argument?
So when we first started operating the Carbon Code, we did allow a few older projects to come on board if they were properly set up as carbon projects. And the current rule is that you have to register within 2 years of the start of planting. But if you register after the woodland's planted, you need some evidence to show that you'd considered carbon finance at the planning stage, and that was part of your project plan. As I said, we are reducing that deadline, so you will need to register within 6 months of planting shortly. And I guess we still wanted to give a little bit of flexibility, given that things tend to be a bit hectic around the planting time. So there's that little bit of flexibility with the 6 months. But again, if you're registering after planting, you really need to show it was part of your planning before you started the planting.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, there's not been any other questions come in, so I think we shall move on.
So
sorry, Derek. I'm sorry.
And I'm conscious of time as well, so there's a couple of just quick ones that I'll just put to Vicky just now, and then we'll have to come back to the end. But question here, so regarding the potential income, was that 2,000 to 6,000 per hectare per year? They're asking, or?
So it's not per hectare per year, it's just per hectare. So it is like a one-off payment. And it's a one-off payment. George might say a bit more, that you can choose to take up front as a one-off now, or you could stage it over time if you sold your carbon units as they were delivered. So again, that's something else to weigh up. And the other thing to think about is your view on risk and the current carbon price, and whether you think it might go up in future or not. So that's another kind of thing to think about. I can't guarantee that it will go up, but the carbon market is certainly looking quite in demand at the moment. So there's a possibility, it's certainly looking like prices will go up.
Yeah. That's great. You've actually answered quite a lot of the other questions in this, so we'll refer to some of them at the end. But
okay.
Thanks for that, Vicky. That's much appreciated. I'll just pass over to yourself now, George, and I'll let you change your screen, share your screen.
Hey, Jack, thank you. Thought I'd just start off by giving a brief overview as to kind of Forest Carbon's role within the carbon market. We are the leading developer of woodland creation projects for the UK voluntary carbon market. We've helped to co-fund over 175 new woodland creation projects across the UK, ranging from 5 hectares up to 350 hectares. Approximately 70% of these projects have been in Scotland, unsurprisingly. You can see a cluster of those projects on the map. The funding comes from selling carbon credits to UK businesses wishing to mitigate the impacts of their carbon footprints. Carbon sequestration is only one of a wide range of co-benefits that the woodland creation projects are delivering. All our projects undergo a rigorous quality assurance process under the UK government's Woodland Carbon Code, which clearly Vicky has gone into depth on. And we have been active in developing the peatland carbon market in the UK as well. And we have also developed Ireland's first carbon projects working on behalf of Microsoft. I've set out here some of our key milestones we've hit since we started in 2006. I think it's important to note that to date we've transacted 90% of all pending issuance units that have been validated via the Woodland Carbon Code, which in turn has enabled the creation of approximately 13,500 acres of new woodlands across the UK. I thought I'd just briefly touch on the fact that we've had a long-standing relationship with SAC and have helped co-fund 15 projects to date that they have had a hand in establishing, and I think we've got another 3 in the pipeline, and 2 of the projects here are ones that we've helped co-fund historically up in the north of Scotland back in 2015 and 2017. Vicky has very helpfully explained the background to the Woodland Carbon Code and how it works. I was keen to set out the process of how to secure carbon funding via Forest Carbon, which is one potential avenue landowners or land managers can explore in order to secure carbon funding. The first step is the completion of our application form, and that can either be by the project host, their forest manager or advisor. And this must be submitted to us well in advance of planting starting. We will then review the information provided and assess the project with close consideration to those key requirements of the Woodland Carbon Code, which again Vicky touched on. If we are happy with the project, and it's one that we are keen to take on, we will then make an offer for the carbon, and this offer would include the price, the payment structure and the proposed contract duration. What we are offering to purchase is the pending issuance units, those PIUs, that are delivered by the project over an agreed contract duration period. And if that offer is acceptable to the project host, we will then issue a contract for signing. Once planting is completed, Forest Carbon will then take on the responsibility to take the project through the validation process under the Woodland Carbon Code by the appointed certification body. And once the project is validated, we will then make the first 70% payment of the carbon to the project host. And this is typically within 6 months of planting. 5 years later, the project is then inspected, and on the basis that it passes the verification checks carried out by the independent certification body, we would then make the final 30% payment to the project host. I just touched on the fact that once we have a contract agreed for a project and once we have secured validation, we then go out proactively to seek a purchaser for the carbon that we've acquired from a particular project. And dependent on the volume of carbon that project holds, it could take us anywhere between a year or up to 3 years potentially post establishment to sell all the carbon from a particular project. So it doesn't necessarily happen overnight. I thought I'd touch on pricing, I suppose, just to kind of carry on from kind of what Vicky touched on. Currently, we at Forest Carbon are able to raise for project hosts between £1,000 and £3,500 per net planted hectare. and this is paid out in those 2 tranches at year 1 and year 5. And to be clear, this is in addition to any available grants that the project might be able to secure. This is clearly based on the future carbon that the project is anticipated to sequester, less those buffers that Vicky touched on that reflect scientific risk and project failure risk. And we utilise the Woodland Carbon Code lookup tables and carbon calculator to come up with those forecasts. The rate and level of sequestration is clearly influenced by the species mix of the project, yield class, soil type, ground preparation techniques, and long-term management plans. Whether the project's going to be thinned and felled or left as a non-intervention woodland will all have a bearing on the level of sequestration. The funding range that I set out above typically equates to approximately 15 to 30% of the cost of establishment and management over the first 10 years of the project, i.e. that's the cost of the trees, the ground prep, fencing, labour, for example. The carbon funding can generate a surplus for the landowner. However, this is dependent on the cost of the project and the volume of carbon the project is estimated to sequester. Pricing is also influenced by geography and project profile. Projects that have a scarcity in a particular geographical location may derive a higher price due to demand pressures. Most businesses will also want to buy carbon from woodlands with a strong story and clear benefits to society, whether they're social, hydrological, or ecological, and projects that can present some or all of those co-benefits can command higher pricing. I've produced this slide, I suppose, to demonstrate different carbon sequestration rates of different project profiles. The red and blue lines at the bottom of the graph reflect predominantly commercial conifer projects, either being clear-felled or thinned and clear-felled. And it is evident from this chart from year 30 onwards that the carbon sequestration tails off and is capped at somewhere between 200 and 250 tonnes of CO2 per net hectare. Clearly, there are some variations on that depending on the quantum of native broadleafs that you would have incorporated within that particular scheme. The top purple line represents a purely non-intervention native broadleaf project, and it demonstrates that by year 100, this project is anticipated to sequester at least twice the carbon of the clear-fell conifer scheme, and this adopts the Woodland Carbon Code. This is clearly adopting the Woodland Carbon Code lookup tables. I thought again it was important to cover off some of those key commitments that are placed upon landowners and land managers in sort of committing to a carbon contract. The Woodland Carbon Code states that the contract's got to be at a minimum of 30 years, and our contracts, as a consequence, adhere to this requirement. Projects must demonstrate that they are additional, as Vicky alluded to, with carbon funding being critical in enabling them to proceed. So this, for example, could be driven by the need to bridge the deficit between the grant available and the cost of a project, or it could be to make up for any future income forgone. Whilst every project validated under the Woodland Carbon Code contributes 20% of the gross claimable carbon to a risk buffer, there is still an obligation to replant in the event of loss or damage, and we would therefore recommend that project hosts ensure their woodland creation projects where possible. And should there be a change of ownership, we have a requirement to be informed, and again our contract has a clause that covers this scenario should it arise, and should a future owner of that land not be prepared to take on the terms of the contract. I thought I would touch on here some kind of alternative options and routes to market that landowners or land managers could consider in the respect of the generation of carbon credits. One option available, as Vicky again touched on, is that it could be that landowners and land managers look to sell the carbon directly, maybe through their own network, through local or national business connections they may have. But again, they would need to recognise that there would be a cost obligation to validate the project and verify the project longer term to keep those units live. Another option that they could consider would be retaining the PIUs to potentially report against future farm emissions or landholding emissions. And this might well become increasingly important as organisations look closely at supply chains and emissions associated with the production of food, for example. A third option could be to retain the pending issuance units and sell as woodland carbon units over the longer term. So at increments over the long term, that could be year 5, year 15, year 25 and onwards, as the carbon is sequestered and verified. In this case, you may be seeking to speculate on the future rise in the price of carbon. However, it would not provide you with the certainty of funding up front if this was a necessity to unlock a project and finance a project. I'm just going to run through now 4 examples of projects that we've helped co-fund across different parts of Scotland. The first was a project in Argyll and Bute, Stronophean, and this is one of 4 projects that have been established by JDM Woodland Management that we have helped support. This particular project is a diverse, predominantly native broadleaf woodland that will be managed on a continuous cover basis. The land here was bought by a German ecologist who had a keen interest in woodland creation. The land had been out of agricultural production for somewhere in the order of 15 to 20 years. Carbon funding here played a critical role in enabling the project to proceed, given the very high cost to prepare and establish this challenging site. This was alongside the high cost required to accommodate the planting contractors locally who worked on the planting. The carbon here was acquired by Reflex, and they're a leading UK sustainable packaging company. This project is the second we've done working with Borders Forest Trust at Towler and Gainshope. For those who don't know Borders Forest Trust, they're an environmental charity that work to restore native woodlands in the south of Scotland. In this case, the Forestry Grant Scheme support was approved for the scheme, but this did not, however, cover the costs of the work to plant, establish and maintain this new native woodland, either upfront or over the longer term. This shortfall in grant was particularly relevant in relation to the 5.5 kilometres of deer fence that were required to be implemented on this site. And given the exposed and remote location, this had particularly high costs in comparison to the available grants. The sale of the carbon credits was vital to supplement this grant income to enable the delivery, the planting, the establishment and the management longer term, along with the necessary deer control. The carbon was sold to a wide range of businesses, including Rolls-Royce, Bolt, Hewlett-Packard, Urban Outfitters, amongst others. And we also gave the opportunity to our Carbon Club members to buy carbon from this particular project, and that's something that Vicky touched on. This project was one which we worked on with SAC, with Stephen Adlard last year. This based in the Scottish borders, and this particular project was made up of lots of thin shelter belt strips. And again, here there were some particularly high fencing costs to overcome from a cost perspective. And again, carbon funding played a critical role in unlocking this project. This is a project a little bit more historic, further north, up at Abbey Moor, that we helped co-fund back in 2012, where we worked in conjunction with SAC's team at Tariff. A major consideration for the tenants who we worked with on this project was the loss of farm income from converting 17.5 hectares of grazing ground to woodland. Carbon funding was critical in persuading the tenants to progress with the project. The bottom photograph here shows Andy Wells from the Crown Estate, who was the landlord and their agent, alongside the tenant Tilly Smith. The buyer of carbon from this project was ICAP PLC, who are a financial city trading company. This particular project is an amalgamation of a number of individual projects, and it's a great example of the benefit of collaborating with a range of partners to deliver woodland creation projects across a wider catchment. In this case, we work closely with Tweed Forum, an environmental charitable trust based in the Scottish borders. Speed Forum had identified woodland creation opportunities to slow runoff and increase flood storage, as well as improving the physical condition of local watercourses. Crucially, funding that Forest Carbon was able to raise from a range of partners who I've listed on this slide helped to go some way to cover the cost of the woodland creation, and in certain cases provide an additional income stream over and above costs. Carbon funded acted as an incentive to land managers to engage with the project by going some way to helping to maintain the profitability of their farming enterprises. This wider project, which included the remeandering of the Eddleston Water, which is a tributary of the River Tweed, will continue to be monitored by Dundee University, SEPA and Scottish Borders Council, and the results will help develop thinking around natural flood management. I was keen just to finally kind of touch on a peatland restoration project that we helped co-fund back in 2017. This was a restoration project that extended to 77 hectares and combined a mix of actively eroding and drained blanket bog. It involved the reprofiling of 9.5 kilometres of hags and the damming of 3.7 kilometres of drains. And it was estimated that the work carried out would prevent the emission of nearly 6,500 tonnes of CO2 over a 45-year period. The carbon funding here was provided by Next Group, who provided that carbon funding alongside co-funding from the Nature Scot Peatland Action Fund and the Scottish Rural Development Programme. The carbon funding covered part of the capital cost, as well as providing the landowner with a surplus paid out at year 1 and at year 5. Whilst the emission reductions that the project will deliver over the long term was clearly of interest to Next Group, they were also attracted by the wider co-benefits that the restoration will deliver, including floodwater storage, improved water quality and the enhancement of biodiversity. This was the first project to be validated under the Peatland Code. We're in the process of funding a second restoration project in the Scottish Borders very shortly. And we're also hopefully of funding further projects in Wales and in the north of Scotland over the next 6 to 12 months. I'd like to finish up with a slide showing some of the wide range of partners we have worked with over recent years. I think this is testament to the many hours that we have invested in both identifying and then developing close relationship with these organisations. And often this can be over a number of years before they make a commitment to invest in a project. So I think whilst there is growing interest in this space from the corporate sector, there is considerable work involved with nurturing those relationships and actually converting carbon into genuine income for landowners or land managers. Many thanks for your time, and I think I'm happy to open up to questions now, and then maybe Vicky can join as well to step in and address some of these questions as well. Many thanks.
Thanks very much, George. That's really interesting to hear how these carbon projects work in practice. There's 2 or 3 questions here. Is there a minimum area of peatland that would have to be restored to qualify for carbon credits? Somebody here has got to be about half an acre that they would consider restoring.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't believe there is a minimum. I think what is a critical consideration in that is the cost associated with the validation, the future verification of that project. And it might well be that on such a small scale that the costs of that certification process at the outset and longer term, I suspect would outweigh the income gain that might be derived from restoring that peat. But I certainly wouldn't want to put a line through it, and it might well be sensible to investigate for that particular individual to explore that in more detail. But I think that's just one point to raise, that it might well be the costs kind of outweigh the gain.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Will it be possible to attract carbon credits for verified biodiversity gain in existing woodlands where herbivores are removed completely, similar to the old livestock exclusion annual premium?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think biodiversity net gain is being implemented in England as we speak, and I think it's likely that over the coming years we are likely to see it implemented in planning legislation in Scotland, and we are certainly keeping a close eye on that space in the context of the development of woodland creation projects in England and entire woodland creation projects in Scotland. From a carbon perspective, the Woodland Carbon Code deals specifically with the creation of new woodlands, as opposed to improved management of woodlands. So, from a carbon perspective, the particular scenario that you posed would not qualify. From a biodiversity net gain perspective, perhaps, but it's not an area of expertise for me. I don't know whether Vicky, you've got any additional comments on that area.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether that's something that was specifically covered within the biodiversity net gain process at the moment. As George said, at the moment we don't include changes to the management of existing woodland, although it may be something that we include in future.
Okay, thank you. One that's just come in is what's your thoughts on the retention of WCUs and selling in the future?
Do you want me to go first, or?
Yeah, go for it. Over to you.
So I guess none of us have a crystal ball in terms of what might happen with the carbon price. In other markets, verified units do attract a slightly higher price than pending issuance units or promise to deliver units. What we can say is that with all the current changes in legislation and increase in demand, it looks like there will be a market for those units, but we can't guarantee that the price would be more, I guess. I don't know if you want to add to that, George.
Yeah, thanks, Vicky. I think what's important to consider is the necessity of funding at the outset of the project. If there is a major deficit between the grant and the cost of establishment, and that is a deficit that you yourself can't finance, then there might be a necessity to realise some of the income from a sale of the carbon credits. It might be you decide, well, to maybe retain part but sell parts to kind of bridge that gap. But I think that is a critical decision. If you can finance the project at the outset and you can demonstrate that you are financing it from your own means up front on the basis of realizing a future income from selling the woodland carbon units, then that is acceptable. But you clearly are taking on the cost obligation of kind of having to verify them long term, and you are speculating on potentially a rise in the price of carbon. One way to approach it is potentially a balance. So maybe sell some at the start and maybe retain some. But it completely depends on the profile of project, how costly it is, and what your own individual circumstances.
Okay, thank you. Here's an interesting one. I wonder, Vicky, this might be one for you. If the scheme is registered at planting for, say, a 40-year cycle with intended clear fell at the end of that cycle, is it then possible to amend that management plan and register for additional carbon units? For example, if in 40 years' time timber prices are too low to make the felling commercially viable, could reassessment for further credits be sought to retain the woodland for, say, another 40 years?
So I guess this is something we haven't really formally put into the standard yet, and a few people have been asking recently is, what happens if in future we change the management? And I think probably what will come is that at some point there will be a process by which you can include changes to the management of existing woodland, and you would have to think about it in that context, I think. And again, you'd have to think about we might have to reconsider the additionality aspect in terms of you then looking to generate extra income from more carbon units.
Okay,
so at the moment,
something
it's
that's
not really possible, but
okay, so potentially something for the future.
yeah.
Yeah. Somebody's asking, is a woodland scheme fenced and just about to start planting? Could they still register for the carbon trading? Presumably, that would to do that, as you were saying, they would need to have some sort of evidence that carbon finance was considered at the planning stage.
Yeah, and clearly showing that the project isn't viable in the longer term, and that can include your income forgone without those carbon payments.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's sort of become clear throughout this is that this is not just something a sort of a dead simple bolt-on of income to the grants. There needs to be some careful thought to it. There's some quite various rules and regulations that must be taken into account in the Woodland Carbon Code, and I think particularly this sort of emphasis on social environmental benefit really is something that will improve the sort of carbon value of a woodland. Would that be correct to say?
So certainly in terms of the ease of selling it, if you can show these wider benefits and also the potential price that you might generate.
Yeah, Mark, I think on that point, we're often asked, it's an opportunity to sell the other co-benefits, separately from the carbon, and a lot of work and research and papers have been done around this space. I think new markets will be developed and come online in due course. Some of those co-benefits are easier to measure and monitor over the long term than others. But there are examples of where you're talking about kind of other benefits of water utility companies paying for the reduced cost of treatment downstream by investing in projects in the upper catchments in their particular area. So and it could be that is an additional income that could sit alongside the carbon that's being sold. So in terms of a kind of a value enhancement, I think those markets will develop, and I think it's definitely a space to keep a close eye on moving forwards.
Yeah. Okay. I'm conscious that we're just coming up to 7 o'clock, but there was another question here that hopefully we can squeeze in, and it was so the question is, what profit margin does Forest Carbon take? But I think to expand on that, how do what are the other models of selling carbon? I think with yours, as I understand it, it's there's the costs are passed on. Correct me if I'm wrong, but with others, perhaps the validation costs and so on are borne directly by the scheme owner. Can you expand on that a bit, George?
Of course. Yeah, I mean, almost exclusively we take on the cost obligations of validation and future verification over the long term, rather than that sitting with the owners or the land managers. So that presents a cost. What we also do is take risk. We provide certainty and payments to owners and managers, often well in advance of us ultimately selling the carbon. And I think I kind of emphasised that in a couple of my slides, that it doesn't happen instantly at the sale of the carbon. It can sometimes take a long period, and we are taking financial risk. we are constantly balancing that financial risk based on kind of supply and demand at any point in the cycle, and as a consequence, you know, our profit margin will vary from project to project, and kind of so it's not as easy as saying for one particular project our profit margin is going to be X. It varies, pricing varies from ultimately what we're paying for projects and ultimately what we're then selling the carbon for. So in a roundabout way, it varies, but I think it's important to acknowledge that we are taking on risk in terms of the model that we present. How other organisations, how other intermediaries may well, you know, what their offering is may well differ. You know, could be that some other organisations are looking to directly match buyers with projects. That in itself might present a lag effect in terms of how quickly you can potentially realise the income from your project. I hope that's helpful, but delighted to have a further conversation with that particular individual who might want to discuss in more detail.
I think if I just add in a little bit more about some of the other agents, so there are other models out there. Some of the agents just charge a fixed fee to put your project through the validation, and they maybe don't offer to find you a buyer, so you might need to do that yourself. Some of them might charge a fixed fee or a percentage of the carbon income as their fee, and help you find a buyer. So there are a variety of models, and I guess as a landowner you need to work out which one you're most comfortable with. So the forest carbon model provides you with less risk because forest carbon take on all the responsibility for validation and verification, and they guarantee to find you the buyer, whereas with some of the other agents you might still have more risk. It might take you longer to find a buyer through a different process, but the fee structure will be different with the agent.
Okay, dokie. Well, there's not been any more questions have come in. It's just gone 7 o'clock, so we should probably wind up there. Incredibly formative webinar. I hope you've all found it beneficial for yourselves, and giving you a bit more insight as to what the Woodland Carbon Code is about, why it's there, and the sort of rules and regulations behind it, why the additionality is such a big thing, and why it's so important to follow, and then just latterly some examples and different charging structures and so on as well. But if I can just wind up by thanking Vicky and George on behalf of you all, and for Jack as well, who's been working the presentation in the background and keeping all the technology up and running. And thank you all very much for tuning in and taking part. Thank you very much, and good night.
Thanks everybody.
Mark.